Okay, and where we stand on this? Can you hear me, Tanya? No. Nope.
Yes, I can.
Okay, thank you. How about you, Jeffrey? Can you hear me? Thank you. All right, if everybody's here, I'd like to get started. It's 10 o'clock and I'd like to kind of get through a few things here. Last time we ended, we talked about individual goals. And that's going to come into play when we bring Jeffrey in at the end, because he shared his experience with short-term rentals in various states and what have you, and that's going to be invaluable to us. You all should have received a copy of the rental program, GRT revenue for the last 5 years. So what I'd like to start with is going over that. If you have your copies, I'll have Ellen Lorraine take us through the analysis of the rental license and GRT.
So what's been provided is information for the last 5 fiscal years. I looked at the amount of gross receipts rental tax the city received for 22, 21, 20, 19, and 18, as well as the number of rental licenses that were renewed in each of those fiscal years. As you can see in 22, there was a significant increase in GRT received, almost 800,000. It was 792,301 over the 21 fiscal year, which was 576,933. However, the license renewed was a decline. We went from 511 in 21 down to 450 in 22. So that averages per license a GRT payment of $1,760 in 22 compared to $1,129 in 21. And if we look at 2018, when the city received 523,000 GRT and 532 rental licenses, the average payment was $984. So we've almost doubled it in 22. So this gives us some information. I know one of the goals of the committee was to not negatively affect city revenues. So I thought having this would provide this information and keep it what we need to be looking at going forward.
And just for clarification, 984, is that the annual revenue per
That's the
unit?
average,
Average, okay.
average, by taking the licenses renewed and dividing it into the GRT received.
Do you know how many single family dwellings are in the city of Lewis?
No,
We're working on it.
yes, we are still analyzing some of that and then going through some of our host compliance information. It's going to be hard to pull out single family versus, because we don't ask for that classification, but we'll see what information we can obtain.
We were hoping to have it this time, Don, but we didn't have an opportunity to finish doing it.
Don, are you asking how many single family residences exist as a whole or just as rentals?
Yeah,
Okay.
just the whole, just want
So
to see what
We
percentage.
might be
of-
able to get that from the census.
Yes.
The census does track that, so.
Or your tax records.
The percentage of rentals versus full-time or
Okay.
second homeowners.
I think Tanya just said
I
something.
think she did too. Tanya?
Yeah, I was just saying that I wonder if you could extrapolate that from tax records, at least roughly
Okay,
the number.
okay, we will do that.
Should be in the comp plan, I would think, too.
Well, the comp plan would have the 2010
2010.
data.
Okay.
But I mean, it should be easily obtainable from the census website.
Or the American Community Survey, too.
Is that it, El?
Yes, it is.
All right, thank you so much. As I said before, we talked with Jeffrey and we went over what we thought our personal goals were. We've had an opportunity to talk with him and sort of guide us on what our next steps should be. So he's here to walk us through the beginning of this. Jeffrey, you want to start?
Sure. Sorry, my daughter's birthday was yesterday, so I chased a toddler around a park, so I'm a little tired. The thing that I think we're running into, and in talking to you both at the previous meeting and in between, is the growing sense sometimes that of being overwhelmed. Right, there are so many different possibilities. There's so many different ways to go. There's so many different facets to look at that. I think the next task is about developing some way to choose a path forward. Now, that doesn't mean it has to be a perfect thing where you're locked in for the rest of this process, but just to begin to gather your thoughts, to think about what are some of the prime mechanisms we can use, but really what are the what is the outcome we'd like to see, and slot that into many of the topics that I saw. Thank you for sending me the comp plan and some of these other things. How does this issue fit into the broader goals of the community, but also some of those very specific things that are addressed in the comp plan, just as a way to start to organize your thoughts and to be able to have some sort of screening process almost of when push comes to shove and I'm presented with 2 or 10 options, how am I going to make a choice that this is better than this? This is leads to something that I want to see more. And that can be surprisingly difficult. The words that we use often to describe some of these things are, neighborhood preservation. What does that really mean? Neighborhood character. What does that really mean? The the next step is to look at some of this data, look at your comp plan, look at all these other sources of information, and to begin to develop, I call it a lens because I like weird branding, but something that allows you to start to say, I'm going to kind of put this as a top priority, and this is a secondary priority, and this is a third priority on this issue, so that when you're presented with regulatory choices, you'll be able to say, okay, this upholds my top priority. This is probably more important. This is less important because it's more about, second or third priorities, just as an organizing system, because I think all of us have kind of sat down and started to imagine what something would look like. And then suddenly it's like, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? What about this? And then at the end of it, you're like, well, there's almost too many things to deal with, and then it's very hard to deal with. So I would say that is the next step, is developing a lens or kind of prioritization scheme based off of something like the comp plan or the values in the comp plan, just to help you organize your thoughts and put shape to many of the things that you're interested in doing.
How do we go about that?
Well, there's really 3 inputs to that, I would say, that's worth looking at. And number 1 would be the data. So, what is the actual short-term rental market in town? Often if you talk to neighbors, they'll say every single house is a short-term rental. You look at the data, it's not quite that fine. What's the long-term rental situation? I know there's quite a bit of interesting data even in the comp plan that explains some of the difficulties of housing in town. That gives you a sense of what's really happening within the market and within the relationship between long-term and short-term housing, let's say. The second piece would be a lot of anecdotes, but anecdotes are important too. What's the situation on the ground? What are people feeling, right? At the end of the day, it's about people in the community. So what are they feeling? And I think from hosts and investors, they'll say one thing, neighbors often say a different thing, but you don't want to discount those things that, if that's real, if people have real frustrations about living next to a short-term rental, we want to take that seriously. That's not how we're going to regulate everything totally, but you do want to take those seriously. Just like when you hear from hotel or motel or inn owners and they say something about what the lodging market's like, you want to take that as an input and understand where they're coming from. So that whole side of things is about realities on the ground, and you always want to make sure you're kind of covering what people are feeling. The third piece is something like a comp plan, something like a housing needs assessment, something like some of these tax and data points. What is the long-term vision for the community? What is the citywide vision for the community? What are some of the constraints within city government or county government or state law or federal law? Those three input pieces allow you to address all the kind of elements of this issue, and allow you to start to think about what individual pieces from that triangle are most resonant to you or feel the most important. And I think all of you have an inkling of what that is. I don't think any of you are sitting there going, I have no idea anything I care about. I think you have some things that you care about. A lens is really a tool to start to look at the things that you care about and break them down and see how they relate to other pieces in the community. And that allows you to then, like I said, it's a goal, it's a priority, it's a value. I use a lot of wishy-washy words, but
Figure out, I hear what you're saying.
yeah.
I'm trying to figure out how we actually hands-on get started doing this. I hear what you're saying. I respect what you're saying, but I'm old school. I'm kind of like, I'm ready to go, and I
Right.
know how to get there.
Sure. So I would say the next step would be to, either individually or probably individually and then collectively, really start to figure out a prioritization, and say, when push comes to shove, even in very broad terms, we're going to prioritize housing. It doesn't even need to be affordable housing. It doesn't need to be housing in certain zones. Just in a broad sense, housing is the priority number one. Priority number two is economic development. Priority number three is, I don't know, environmental sustainability. I mean, that shouldn't be necessarily what you do, but I'm just throwing it out there. And start to think about what those priorities are, because as you saw even in our last meeting, people are going to present ideas, and you need to be able to start to say, okay, that's really more related to priority 2, or that's more related to priority 5, or that's not a priority at all, or that's not legal. So I think between you probably have some differing opinions, but I think starting to describe your priorities and describe them in relation to something like the comp plan, to be able to kind of point to elements of that and say, this is why we want to do it this way, I think can start to help you organize your thoughts individually and then eventually collectively.
What you got on this?
I'm sorry?
What's your gut on this in terms of how we roll up our sleeves and just get into this? Because I'm kind of at that point.
Well, I think we have to balance, obviously, people who own Airbnbs, what kind of, flexibility are we going to, regulation, I should say, are we going to potentially impose on them beyond just a 5% tax? I mean, are there any restrictions on parking, off-street parking, things like that, versus we also want to protect our citizens who have concerns about noise late at night. It may be their ability to park on the street. So I think that is, to me, I don't view this as an intractable problem. I think we have to respect the property owners and their ability and their needs, for many of them, to rent their property for short-term or long terms and understand what the rules of the game are. But I think those rules have to be, we have to consider our citizens here who have concerns about people coming and maybe overcrowd. Do we limit the number of people in a house?
Yeah.
Things like that.
Mhm.
And then we do that. I think there's not it's not an intractable balance. I think there's a balance here.
Mhm.
I agree. And I think what I see in other developments in other towns, that they do have ordinance officers. I know that we have, our town officers as such, but I think if you had one specific department for ordinance of short-term rentals, we're growing as a community, again, commercially. The Airbnbs are following the commercial. Look at our hotels. We had one hotel, two hotels in Lewis. Now we're getting 3, 4 all out on the highway. So to me, the hotels are following the growth. So that means Airbnb is following the growth of commercial. So my biggest thing is, I don't want to hurt the side of the residents. So in order to protect the people that are here living full time, or someone that's living next to a person that is sharing their home as an Airbnb, I think there should be rules in place. I think parking is a huge deal because Lewis has no parking. Limit the parking per resident, limit the residents per how big the square footage is. I think, like you said in the very beginning, the lens is the great opportunity for us to start to nail down what's the most important thing for Lewis. And Lewis as a whole, it's the residents. I mean, in my opinion, it is the residents. And then anything after that, we should start to evaluate and how the growth is coming in. But I believe what the commissioner is saying, we have to find the best way to protect the residents first, in my opinion, and then therefore put the rules or ordinance officer into place. It does work. I've seen it work. And I don't know if that's anything you've seen with an officer's department.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the rules are only as good as they are enforced. And if and good enforcement comes from investing in enforcement mechanisms, especially in a place that has quite a number of these, whether that's a full-time person or someone who's doing half-time, or, again, you can adjust the staffing and budgeting levels often to the level of enforcement or the detail of enforcement. But at the end of the day, if people don't think they're going to get caught for doing something that they're not supposed to be doing, then it sort of all falls apart. You could have the Mona Lisa of local ordinances, but if no one's there to put it into practice, it's not going to work. I think I just want to point out that, the things that you're saying are goals that are implicitly stated, right? Quality of life, however we define it, is a goal. And there are lots and lots of communities that say the number one thing that we're going to regulate to is a sense of quality of life for our residents and for our guests. We're not going to throw them out. And everything kind of flows from that. Now, that can be difficult because some people's versions of quality of life involve having a big party every weekend, and some people don't. But being able to state that, I think, is going to be really useful to you. I've said this, I think, before, but the goal at the end of this is an ordinance that is reflective of the community values, but also when people may not agree with it, there's always going to be someone who doesn't agree with it, but they'll understand why all the rules exist. They understand what the purpose of all those rules are. They're all pulling in the same direction. They're pulling towards the same goal. And that insulates you from lawsuits, which is always great. And also, I think just lets people accept it better because they understand that the process you work through led to something that is harmonious and it's not 10 people had 10 ideas and then they kind of threw it together in an ordinance. And I've seen a lot of ordinances like that, and they just don't hang together. They're not very effective. They're really hard to enforce. They don't sort of take advantage of all the work that everyone did. So that's a little extra bonus, I guess, is that people really do accept an ordinance because they understand it.
Well,
Again, if they disagree with it, they'll elect new people and change the ordinance, but they at least, it all pulls together.
With you saying that, we have so much building going on in Lewis, and I don't know if you've seen this, but individual builders are making their own deed restrictions based upon, you can rent for 6 months, but you can't rent, weekly, or you can do a turn and burn. Are you seeing that in any townships or are you seeing that like what a builder would do?
Yeah, I've seen things on both ends. So I've seen some places that, especially some of these HOAs in some mountain communities, which are, they're the best kind of enforcement a city could want for. They really come down on anyone doing any sort of short-term rental because they have their goal is community expectations. And people buy into this neighborhood thinking it is going to be retirees and quiet life and looking at trees and all these other things. And short-term rentals are totally disruptive. And so we're just going to ban it. And if you violate that, we'll take you to court. I've seen some of that. I think I've seen the opposite too, where you have developers, especially ones that are building slightly larger neighborhoods even, build into their spreadsheets essentially that some of these are, or maybe all of these are going to be short-term rentals and can sell at a price premium in order to make their profit rather than as long-term housing, because in a lot of places, short-term housing will make significantly more money than long-term housing. So we've seen some places, kind of set the opposite expectation, which is if you buy in here, you need to know that some or all of the rest of the properties might be short-term rentals at various times. And you just have to, you as the buyer need to be okay with that. Those are private deals. And so, yeah, it fits in under the structure of the local government rules. But at the end of the day, that's a private business between the people who buy into those communities.
Jeff, you mentioned short-term rentals, and I believe I recall that short-term rentals were generally defined as a month or less.
Yeah.
It
doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be.
And that's what I wanted to ask you. Can you
Yeah.
talk a little bit, just real briefly, about the range of definitions for short-term rentals?
Sure. So I think the pretty common one is under 30 days. That has a little less to do with short-term rentals itself than usually state tenant laws. So in a lot of states, if you are in a property for more than a month, you get tenant protections and have to be formally evicted. And so lots of places want to obviously avoid that because that is not what this is about, and is also quite complicated. So they usually set it as under 30 days. I've seen some places do 14 days. Some communities where people kind of summer might do it as a slightly longer period. I've seen some places kind of try to divide things up by the summer months versus everything else.
Right.
The other side of things that people often kind of mess with a little bit is minimum stays. So there are a small number, but not a zero number of places that say a short-term rental has to be more than 3 days or has to be a week. But still under 30 days. And I think they're just trying to set the market and the market expectation as this isn't rent it for one night, have a giant party, and then leave. This is, we want to reflect the patterns that we think best fit our community. That can be a little tricky, but I've seen some places do it from the minimum side rather than the maximum
Like
side.
a minimum stay, you've seen that work? Like a 3-night minimum?
I've seen places try it. It depends a little bit on how much that actually changes their market, right? So I've seen some places try to impose that on a place that people are renting it for one day now. And so they got to put a lot of work to kind of reshape the market. I've seen a lot of places, you know, cottage country in Ontario, Canada, where no one's there for a day. It takes 5 hours to drive there anyway. So no one's there for a day. So they're just trying to sort of, you know, match what the market is. And there it's everyone's there at least 3, you know, for the weekend, maybe even longer. So they wanted to just kind of eliminate this possibility, but it was already a very, very small part of their market. You know, it's a little imperfect. It depends again on what you're trying to achieve. If your goal is just quality of life, well, you could have a 364-day minimum, but if that first day people will have a giant party and then just leave, you know, that quality of life thing didn't actually get solved. So it's, you can use it to do certain things, but it's not going to be, you have to make sure that it matches both the industry and, you know, realistically what you're trying to achieve through that rule, or else it's a lot of work for not a lot of payout.
And I would just add that whatever types of parameters we put in, we do need to be cognizant of how readily they'll be able to be enforced and what that means for staffing. Because we don't want to build expectations on something that we don't have staffing to support. One of my questions, somebody brought up earlier, the idea of potentially limiting the number of occupants. How does that typically get enforced without having a city inspector go in and count heads?
Yeah.
That seems like that could be very difficult to enforce.
Yeah, so it'd be very difficult to enforce if you're trying to do it totally on the ground. What most places do is rely on the advertisement
Okay.
to set that violation, which is often you'll do an initial inspection when they apply for permits just to make sure their place is safe and has the number of legal bedrooms that they actually claim. And then that is the limit that needs to go on their advertisements. So if they have 3 bedrooms, a typical maximum number of people would be 8. Often in a lot of places, it's two adults per bedroom plus 2. Kids don't really count. So let's say it's 8. Well, you know what their advertisements are, and if they're advertising for 10, that's a violation of their license, of their permit. You don't have to send someone out to see if they're 10, they're advertising for 10. So you can write that into your ordinance that an advertisement for something beyond the parameters of their license is a violation, and a pretty strict one, because people really should be abiding by that. You know,
If you
theoretically,
if you advertise a maximum, because I've seen this, I just came back from the Outer Banks, maximum occupancy of 10, and 2 sets of pyramid bunk beds in this room, and you know, when you count the beds, you can fit 15. I mean,
yeah.
So you might put on the site that you can have 10, but if looking at the bed configuration, you can fit 15 or more. Isn't that really what's gonna, as the renter, what they're to follow?
So just, I can chime in here and speak from experience. So, you know, I have a VRBO. On VRBO, it clearly states you put in your maximum occupancy. It's actually a rental rule for the renters, right? And if my renters violate my maximum occupancy, I have the right to kick them out of the rental.
Okay.
So mid rental. And then, you know, I don't know if everybody goes as far, but you know, I actually have in my rental agreement that they must state literally names. So I see literally how many people, like by name, are going to be there. And as an owner, I can tell you, I pay super close attention to this. I don't want more than my max occupancy in my house, because I believe that's where I, you know, get into areas of damage in the house. So it is, you know, advertised, and I would say for a lot of, you know, the owners, enforced by the owner.
But that where we're going and touching on the maximum occupancy, where you have to have, if you do have the Airbnb, do you have a number that's somebody that is within proximity within like 10 miles of your home when it's being rented out. Like that's part I've been hearing, like the last meeting, you have to have somebody within like a 10-mile radius to address the Airbnb issue if there is an issue. Like if you're 150 miles away and you find out there's 12 people instead of 10 people, really, what can you do?
Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. So this is a now almost ubiquitous piece of any regulation, probably in the last 3 or 4 years, is a local contact person. Whether that's the owner or someone the owner has put on their application is that local contact person. Even if it's a property manager or whatever it is someone needs to be available 24/7 to address issues. And they are signing on their permit that is what they're going to do. Some places they have to do it in a set amount of time. Some places just say it just has to get done. And that is, I will just say this, unless you're suddenly come around on a ban, that is going to be part of this ordinance, because it is just good practice in order to make sure that someone is there to pick up the phone and deal with quality of life issues, or even something like occupancy or parking or whatever it is. You'd hope that the way that the advertisement is structured and the communication between the host and the guests would prevent a lot of these issues from happening. But when they do occur, a local contact person is I would say ubiquitous at this point, just so that, there's some kind of level of accountability to what's going on the property at all times, whether that's someone on the property or someone in town or someone, no matter where they are, that are going to helicopter in or whatever it is. Someone needs to be accountable to what's going on. And I think I'm sure all the hosts will say good hosts do this already. Like, these are things that good hosts do because they are mindful of their neighbors and mindful of their own investments. So a lot of the operational side of how to run a short-term rental is going to be taking what the best hosts in town do and saying, this is the standard that we're going to require of everyone who wants to get into this industry, because we've seen it work for all these people for quite a long time.
Can I just jump in per Don Long, who just mentioned and was concerned about enforcement, which I think that's a fair point. How do we enforce this? Tanya, have you experienced any situations where you learned that people had exceeded your occupancy level, and have you asked them to, for a couple people to leave? Or, I mean, what's your experience with this personally, as opposed, and also listening to others?
So luckily so far, I haven't actually had to ask anyone to leave, but I have had to question my renters on it, and for two reasons. One, I actually do have a property manager who lives just down the street. So literally very, very close to my house. Carl knows her well, maybe related to him. And so I at times when she drives by and she's seen a lot of cars in the driveway, more than normal, she contacts me immediately and says, hey, looks like a lot of cars, right? Might want to check in with the renters and see what's going on. And then we did have one scenario where our neighbors actually reached out. And we are very open with our neighbors about renting, because we want to be very cognizant of their quality of life. And so we told them, at any point, if you see anything that's concerning to you or is disturbing you, please let us know. And so at one point they did reach out and we did question. And I think at that, the occupancy was, they were under our number. We actually, after that event, actually took our occupancy down by 2. So we moved from a 16-person max to a 14-person max. It's a large home, because we found that, at 16, it seemed to be at max occupancy seemed to be somewhat bothersome to our neighbors.
But excuse me, Tanya, it sounds like you're really responsible and have good oversight. I can speak from personal experience too. We've had 2 Airbnb or 2 short-term rentals adjacent to us on 12 Church Street. And the owners one was in New York City and one was in Wilmington, and they were not on hands-on. One of the rentals had a wedding party with 9 vehicles on Church Street, with a limousine, and another resident or another guest had a boat attached to their car in front of our house. So these are absent, in this case, they're absentee landlords that are running, running a business out of a residential neighborhood. So I think the oversight and accountability, licensing and enforcement is really going to be the hard thing to figure out here for all of us, especially for the city to figure out. I don't see how you have the staff to do that.
You have to hire.
Well, you
out.
have,
You're gonna
yeah.
have to hire someone.
I mean, it depends on what level of enforcement. For instance, parking a boat on the street isn't allowed. So that
That's
would
an
be
easy
something that we would have the police handle. If we get into inspecting dwellings, that does increase the workload, and that could involve additional staff. And then, there's also options to expand our contract with Host, where Host compliance has a phone number that people can call, and that triggers things to happen. But again, you still, just like a property manager, you still need somebody boots
To
on the
oversee.
ground to come and address the things.
I think going forward too, one of the things we want to distinguish is between owner occupied residences
Right.
and ones that are folks that aren't living nearby.
So that's kind of the information we want to get our hands on.
Yeah. And I like the fact that Tanya has a property manager
Yeah,
local that
it
helps
does
out.
work. It does work if you, I think, did you want to say?
Yeah, I wanted to ask Adrian a question, how do you handle midnight calls? Adrian, you're a realtor, correct? For those who don't know, could you give me some idea if how that's done? If we have a problem trying to figure out how folks are overbooking and that kind of things, I'm not quite sure how you do an emergency thing when somebody comes in and they said, any idea how you work that?
You can come to the mic, we've got people online.
Hello, thank you. So typically we have an on-call service. So each of my agents takes a week and they're on call 24/7.
Oh, I see.
So if something emergency related happens, the agent is contacted and then they deal with the situation. There are different levels of emergency and what that means. When I worked in the Rehoboth area, Dewey Beach, I was always having to kick out, June week kids, senior week kids. So the Dewey Beach police officer would call me up, I'd drive to Dewey, I'd meet them, and we would escort the kids from the house. So, there are, again, different levels of what you're dealing with. You're not dealing with that so much here in Lewis. We've, knock on wood, don't have those kind of problems, but certainly we would handle it if need be.
Adrian, can I ask you, so Don has mentioned the parking problem
Mhm.
that we have. Can you talk a little bit about that from your experience, as well as any other potential problems like noise or others that you have heard from residents here who are upset with short-term rental folks?
So the only parking problems we hear are if someone is blocking another person's driveway. There are no restrictions on parking in Lewis other than meters. So if there were designated spots and they were parking in someone's parking spot, then that's something we could address. I haven't really had owners call me that there are an exorbitant number of cars, because I don't think we really identify whose car belongs to a renter versus a homeowner versus somebody that's, in the city shopping for the day. When it comes to noise violations, again, very limited. I think I've had maybe 2 in the 15 years I've been in Lewis. And we've just called the folks, been like, hey, you guys are having too much fun at, 9 o'clock at night, tune it down. And they do. So.
I know my own experience. I've done just that.
So Adrian, if you have like a go-to agent when, like in the middle of the night, and if all things fail, the agent gets called. So with the gentleman too, if we had the property management, then you would suggest then it would have to be definitely the owner that gets awakened after that. Like owner plus property management gets the call. Do you ever see agent and whoever's on call that week get called at the same time or
I
no?
think it would have to be a pretty extraordinary circumstance, such as, God forbid, the house was struck by lightning, it caught on fire.
Okay.
You know, there was some major catastrophe, but that's pretty much what we're hired for, is to be that person that's in the middle. So the owner doesn't have to deal with it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate that. All right, so where do we want to go from here? We've got all of this.
Maybe we should ask anyone else in the audience if they have any insight they want to share regarding problems that have occurred, whether again, noise, parking or otherwise. Because I think, as we mentioned, yeah, Kim would be great. As Jeff mentioned, I think, we want to look for data, but we also want to look for anecdotal stories. And I think, maybe Adrian just gave us a little bit of anecdotal information, and I think we should pursue as much as we can.
Okay, Kim Avazian, 312 Pilot Town Road. And I'll give you first a little anecdote, and then I'll go on to what may or may not be considered data.
Okay, talking to the mic.
Okay,
Kim.
sorry. First of all, we have a house next door to us that is rented. The owner comes very infrequently, but most of the time, the rental is very short term, or has been very short term. And then the house is unoccupied for a long period of time. That's fine. We can deal with that. But when the renters leave, the short-term renters leave, they take out all the garbage cans and the recycling bins. And there is no one to return them to their place. So everything's on the sidewalk. Now, if I were a really good person, every time that happened, I would pull those cans back to the proper place, which I've done, my husband's done. But after a while, it gets a little annoying because they're making money, or the owner of the house is making some money, and I'm doing the work. So we've stopped that now. Could there be an incentive? Like the trash people would, if the carts are out there for too long, could they just take them and then someone else would have to come back and find them later?
So, I'm going to look at Adrian a little bit. Isn't
She's
that something
answer
typically
that.
that property managers will do it as part of a service?
As a routine.
Okay.
Obviously, we will if it becomes an issue, but this is also, Lou and I talked about that, having some kind of concierge trash service in this.
Mm-hmm,
Similar to
Absolutely.
homeowner pays.
mm-hmm.
Oh, can you, sorry, that,
It does work in Rehoboth too.
Rehoboth has a concierge trash service.
Oh, do they?
Where homeowners pay a fee to have trash cans brought back up to the house. So
It works.
the rental guest never has to move a trash can, which is the complaint we always hear. They check in on Saturday, they've got a week's worth of trash they have to take out on Monday or Tuesday. That's not their own trash. And then they leave their trash for the next people to take out. So trash is a huge problem. And I also suggested maybe a roving trash truck on Saturdays. Because we do have a lot of people that turn on Saturday and they'll just leave a can of trash sitting out for 2 or 3 days. So you maybe not advertise, but it would help with some of that trash issue. And then concierge service would, really fill the
It
need.
does. I think that should be addressed. It does work. I mean, Rehoboth has had less complaints by just getting that service in place. That could be another ordinance.
Well, it's just a comment. And,
Yeah.
and we try to be neighborly, but then you feel like you're being taken advantage of. And that gets to me. Now, as
We-
far as data is concerned, and I took this upon myself, the last couple of weeks, I've been walking around the historic district and trying to determine, without stepping on anyone's private property, which houses have off-street parking. Because the historic district, which I'm most concerned about, and I live in the historic district, has, these closely packed homes on various streets.
Right.
And to the extent that some people do not have off-street parking just because the houses are were built too close together. Others who've chosen to, say, put a tree where there was a driveway and a curb cut, but now they've got a little extended garden. And I just wanted to go around and survey approximately how many houses have adequate off-street parking. And I personally defined adequate as two off-street parking spaces. And I can tell you, based on my very rough calculations, walking around the historic district, that there are certain neighborhoods that have very few off-street parking spaces.
That could be addressed by Adrian again. Do you want to say about how residents that do rent their homes in Rehoboth, they get 2 parking permits? Is that correct? So anything additional, they pay, right? So let's say you would want to rent your house, and this is Rehoboth. You automatically get with your home 2 parking permits.
So where would those parking?
They have to find permitted, Adrian, go ahead. Parking where there's permits on the street, correct?
So in Rehoboth, the residents get 2 stickers. So your car would have a sticker. And then you would get 2 hang tags to give to your rental guest or whoever you wanted to give them to. But I understand your concern is that there are a lot of houses in Lewis that do not
They
even
have
have.
Right,
off-street
anything,
parking.
They don't have a
anything,
driveway. So,
anything,
and the
yeah.
Parking
Right, so
is public.
if you had 1 spot for each house that's designated for that
Mhm.
house, I think it would be hard to say 2, but that may help.
Right. That's like she's addressed, and I don't mean to say she, Adrian has addressed so many issues from the Rehoboth side. She's actually grown and watched everything change. And she's right. If we have 1 small house, maybe 1 permit per that small house for that street. Is that what you're saying? Something like, I mean, for the resident that should only get 1 parking permit.
Hey, Winnie, sorry, can I jump in here? We don't have a permit system in Lewis, like, period.
No, I know, but I'm thinking for ordinances or something that, like when the gentleman was saying we have a lens and then we look and see how we can set this up to protect residents. But please, I apologize. Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to say that there are at least 2 houses on one of the streets in the historic district that both have rental signs out for them in front
Yes,
of their
I know
houses, and they have
exactly what you mean.
no
No,
off-street
no
parking.
off street.
So if you were going to do a regulation or enforcement of that, those houses would be ineligible for any short-term rentals. So it's just, I thought it was important, and people
Mhm.
are free to disagree with me because I did this on my own. I thought it was important to see what the context in the historic district was in terms of homes, rentals, driveways, off-street parking of any sort. And there are places where if there were a number of short-term rentals and cars were coming, none of the homeowners or a large proportion of the homeowners on that street might not have a parking spot.
And that's the essence of
That's it.
your,
Yeah.
your
Well,
challenge.
I just think I think we should stop comparing ourselves to Rehoboth. We're not Rehoboth Beach, and hopefully we won't become Rehoboth Beach. No disrespect to Rehoboth Beach, but we're an historic town on the water. We have something more to offer, a unique something to offer. And I'm concerned that we keep comparing it. We don't have a parking permit system like was mentioned. I think we need to focus more on quality than quantity. And I feel like Rehoboth is all about quantity, trying to get more people into rental units. What I'm seeing outside the historic district are some of the tear downs are now becoming these large box shaped houses with the whole front yard is a parking lot to hold 3 or 4 cars.
Absolutely.
Now, that won't happen in downtown because of the constraints of the proximity of the homes. And the challenges with off-street parking, but that's not, I don't want to see that here. I've been here for 25 years. 18 years of those 25 years, I've volunteered for the city on 3 different committees. I'm very invested in this town, and I want to see the quality of life continue the way it is. I like to visit Rehoboth, but I wouldn't want to live there.
We got that.
Yeah, but
That's strong, Don.
So, but being a resident, my concern is for Lewis, our challenge is parking. It's right up from the get-go, and you're right. Who wants a boat parked in front of, your house? I wouldn't. Commercial trucks. I'm finding now that I'm having commercial trucks parked next. I don't know how to stop the influx of, that's part of the.
I think there was a parking committee a few years ago. It met for over a year, and I don't really know if there was much of an outcome from that.
Right.
I think there's still some opportunity.
Mhm.
There were a lot of challenges, obviously, for parking for business the folks that work at businesses in downtown. I think there's still some chances to try to remedy some of that. I don't know what the answers are.
I'll give a very brief idea, which is parking flows from things upstream. So parking flows from occupancy, right? If you have too many people, or even just a large number of people in these buildings, they all come by car. So that's more cars on the street. Parking also comes from need. So even for long-term residents or long-term renters or homeowners, if you feel like you need a car and need to have to drive all over the place, then you have a car. Also, for people who work in town but don't live in town, they have to drive in to their jobs and park somewhere. And if they lived in town, then maybe they wouldn't have to park or be on the road. So parking is a symptom of something higher up, and it's usually best addressed higher up if you can. Because by the time you get down into creating a parking permit system, you maybe have missed simpler to manage systems higher up in terms of occupancy, residency, those sorts of things. So that maybe this is just me being a planner, but anytime you can try to understand where it's coming from and get it at its source, it's going to be, I think, a little more impactful and easier on you than developing a parking pass system, which I know Atlantic City did about short-term rentals and all these other places, but it's a haul.
We've been working on that for quite a while.
Yeah, we've had two parking committees, one for the beach, one for downtown. I think Don was referencing, and it's a challenge. I mean, I think we've come to the conclusion that parking is finite. I mean, we can't keep generating parking spaces and digging them out of certain places. And Carolyn led the effort last year to move on the Lewis Line pilot program, which is designed to kind of move people as opposed to, anything else. And so that's going on this summer. We'll reevaluate that in the fall, but it's a challenge. I mean, there's no question about it. Parking is, I don't know of any coastal community that doesn't have a parking problem.
Right, no, it's not gonna go away. Go right ahead, please.
Hi, I'm Terry Lottman, 12 Church Street. I've been a full-time resident in town since 1994. I would like to thank both of you for addressing residents. Thank you so much. And it's not just the noise and the parking for me. It's the changing of the integrity of the community. I hear what you're saying about having officers. I live here full time. I give a lot back to this community, and watching neighbors to make sure that I don't want to be the police, and I don't want to be that neighbor. And Don and I we have not had the experience of having somebody like Tanya as our neighbor who's renting their house. I wish we had. It's been kind of a nightmare. Anyway, I also would like to just go on record to know, why do you think developments around us are not allowing short-term rentals? And are there any?
Quality of living.
Well, right.
Yeah.
But
HOAs.
Yeah.
but we don't have anyone protecting us from that. Like, we're just looking for we're not, well, whatever. And also I agree with, I was going to say before Don mentioned it, I'm a little worried when you do a lot of comparisons to Rehoboth Beach. That's all.
I think we also have to learn from Rehoboth Beach. I don't mean to say follow Rehoboth Beach, but I think learning.
We've been here a lot longer than Rehoboth Beach.
I'm
The
born and
same.
raised, I get it.
Yeah.
And I can tell you this sleepy little town, I never thought would grow as fast as it is growing so quickly.
Yeah.
And I think on top of the residents, we do have to put something in place so that we don't let it get out of control. And again, I'll throw Rehoboth. Rehoboth is out of control. Their McMansions, I can't say too much, but it's out of control. And I feel like where we are in this small little community, this community was made of residents. And I understand everyone on this board or the committee is really trying to figure out what's best for everybody. And I appreciate the parking concern and you not wanting to be a police officer. Who wants to be a police officer every day?
I think we can come to an agreement.
Yeah,
think
I do.
If everybody was conscientious, and whether they were owner occupied or not,
Right.
but we've called a neighbor who is a friend, is an acquaintance, who has a short-term rental with a noise complaint. And we were not able to get in touch with this person, and we have their cell phone number. They never returned our call to this day. So it's never been addressed. So I'm just saying that because there's nobody does anything.
But that's
Doesn't
why we're
matter.
here. We're here for the very reason that we want to get something done.
So what I'm hearing, as I know we're coming to upon an hour here,
Yep.
is that we have parking, we have some noise, we have trash concerns.
Yep.
So I think those are the things that we need to start focusing on. And again, I share, we're not Rehoboth. I mean, I think my only interest in hearing about Rehoboth and others is to see what best practices people are employing.
Absolutely.
That's all.
I agree.
And Don, I'm sorry, Jeff, I think you offer a lot of value in sharing with us what other communities do, what works for them, what doesn't work for them. But I just want to say that first and foremost, we want to do what's best for our residents, our taxpayers, and preserve their quality of life. But taxpayers also include, people who rent their homes, short-term rentals.
That's right.
And, they need, like Tanya Flickinger is probably, I think we've learned a pretty good model of what a host should be.
Yeah.
But, how do we mandate and require, that other hosts, perform the way Tanya does? I mean, do we require them to have a local property manager? I don't know if that's something.
I
It's
think
a-
that's a standard
That's an evidence.
practice. I mean, that's a standard practice, a lot of places with any kind of rental.
Right. So that's not even, that's
But our
already a
issue is
practice.
enforcement.
But it's not a practice we employ.
Right.
So
Yeah.
it's certainly a practice that helps to address those issues.
I think, Aaron, you have a question?
Yeah, I just have two quick questions. Actually for Tanya, and Tanya, thank you very much. It's been very informative. What is the legality regarding security cameras at Airbnbs in your properties? Are you allowed to have security cameras on while you are renting out your property?
That's a good question, Aaron. So what we have determined, and I will not give legal advice.
Yeah.
Clear here.
Yeah.
But what we have determined for our own property is we have external cameras. We disclose them in our rental agreement and ask our renters to accept the fact that we do have the external cameras. We do not feel comfortable with internal cameras. I believe they come with a host of privacy and legal issues. So as host, we're not comfortable with those, but we do have external. And actually the external does help. If we get a call from neighbors, right? Lots of cars, our cameras are, they shoot our driveway, they shoot our trash cans, right? Like we have certain spots that we can actually shoot. Actually, this morning, there was a question about trash cans and I looked at my cameras and saw that all 3 of my cans were out. So that's what I can tell you. And I just want to clear off with one other thing before people think that I, singing my praises too much. Because some of my neighbors may be watching. I do want to be clear. I'm sure that I have neighbors that wish that I didn't rent my property. I'm sure that, the fact that I have a larger property and it's on a beach, probably at times my renters crowd some of the residents on the beach. Very cognizant of that, right, to say it. But I do want to be clear that there probably are folks around me that wish that I didn't rent. And I understand that, and I'm sympathetic to it. But it's not a reason that my husband and I are going to decide that we're not going to use our property in the way that we intended to when we purchased it.
All right, thank you very much.
Responsible.
I do have one more question, and I was wondering if there's going to be any coordination or any talks with Tyler Technologies, who is doing property assessment for Sussex County, and if that is going to, the short-term rentals, if that is affecting property values in Sussex County, or if that's something that this committee might be considering, if that's even within the scope of this committee, really.
I don't believe it's within the scope.
Okay.
And my limited knowledge of assessment, I'm not aware of places that assess single family rentals as a business. I think they're typically assessed based on the unit, the fact that it's a house. So
Okay.
I have not seen assessment, and again, it would be a good question for Tyler, but I have not seen in my career difference in assessment between whether a residential property is rented, short-term, long-term, or owner occupied. It's a house.
Yeah, that's.
So, but Tyler, who knows? Tyler's responsible for the methodology, and they would make that determination. I just think it gets hard to maintain your assessment list on the long term as things come on and off the rental market, especially because the county doesn't have a rental license program. So I don't know how the county would even monitor so that there could be consistency in that.
Okay, thank you very much.
I can tell you what other jurisdictions do, and you guys are right. It falls with the county. It falls with whoever is doing the assessment. That's thankfully not your job. Some places it's up to the assessor to decide basically how to assess any property. Other states are obviously much more specific. The biggest issue usually with assessments is around something like a homestead exemption or any sort of tax break that you get for being a primary residency. In places where that exists, such as where I live, such as a lot of states, then it's in the assessor's interest to try to figure out whether you are a full-time short-term rental to understand whether you're committing homestead exemption fraud. If you don't have those types of things, then the only real effect you'll see is if you've had a lot of houses that have flipped, so people are speculating in them as short-term rentals because of maybe making more money from long-term rental, then the comparables for everyone's properties have that built into it. And so that can be frustrating for people who live in their homes and have lived there for quite some time, because now the assessor is going to say, well, based off the 5 homes that sold in your neighborhood, we think your property is actually worth this, but those 5 homes didn't sell to homeowners, they sold to people who are using them as short-term rentals. So that's the only time where the assessor really can maybe futz with things, but that's at the county level. That's not going to be at the town level. And then also what Tyler Technology is going to be doing is based off of whatever the assessor has said how to process those properties. And a lot of times, if there is not a system in place, if there isn't a license system, they're not going to get into it. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, anyone else? Well, we've gathered a lot here today. More than I can begin to just roll back to you, but I think what we'll do at this point is take a real hard look at all these things that we've heard, come up with some way of attacking this in our next meeting. I'll send stuff out to you and let you know what we're going to be going towards and how we're going to get there. And please feel free to contact me at any given time if you have any thoughts, Dawn, Tanya, Jeffrey, I'll get back to you after all of this. So at this point, I'm at a place of closing out the meeting. Anyone have anything else they need to say? I thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
And where